The AMD 7000 series has been out for quite some time, but since their inception, prices have changed, drivers have improved, and with that in mind, I thought it was time to take a bit of a revisit into the 7600X versus the 7700X in 42 games. The reasons may not seem that evident to start, but with the 7600X coming in with a faster base clock, while the 7700X sports a faster boost clock and 2 more physical cores, depending on the games, this could actually lead to some, surprising results. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Great, I've finished my filming, now I just need to get this on here and I can start my edit. No, I'm out of space to store this footage. How am I going to edit this video if I can't get the footage on the PC? I can't delete anything, I need all of this for other projects. I'm doomed!
Conveniently timed delivery.
Ooh, my new NAS. Wait, how did you get in here? With the TBS H574TX NAS book from QNAP, my storage woes are finally over. Featuring the ability to add up to 5 M.2 NVMe drives, storage and speed is no longer a worry. With its slim and stylish design, it looks great anywhere, and you can take advantage of the lightning fast 10GBE capabilities or use Thunderbolt 4 to connect it directly to your system for an easy and convenient storage solution for all your files with no limitations. Click the link in the description to find out more. So in typical fashion, let's talk specs, because this is an interesting one. Firstly, the 7600X, it forms part of the Ryzen 5 series of processors, while the 7700X makes up part of the Ryzen 7 series of processors. In terms of cores, the 7600X comes in with 6 cores and 12 threads, a base clock of 4.7 GHz and a boost clock of up to 5.3 GHz. The 7700X, by contrast, packs 2 more cores, 4 more threads, giving us a total of 8 cores and 16 threads. So a small step up. But the clock speed is what makes this head-to-head the most interesting, as the Ryzen 7 base CPU comes in with a base clock of 4.5 GHz and a boost clock of up to 5.4. And both CPUs come in with a TDP of 105 watts, so at least they're equal there. Now what makes this interesting is that today is all about gaming, and depending on the game, this could go either way. The 7700X has more cores and a 100 MHz higher boost clock, but the 7600X, even though it has lesser cores, actually packs 200 MHz higher on its base clock. And with the way that AMD works in terms of boost speeds, it can work its way up to the max speed, but doesn't generally sit there consistently. And games typically only run on a few cores anyway. So what we want to find out is if the 7700X with its more cores and faster boost clock can beat the 7600X with its fewer cores but faster base clock. And if it does win, by how much? And that's what makes this one quite intriguing, especially given the difference in price. The 7600X can be had right now for a little under $209, while the 7700X is a pretty staggering 45% more expensive at a little over $301. Sure, the 7700X with its increased core and thread count will make a difference in workload related tasks, but today is all about gaming. And I can say right now, before we even look at the results, that you're not going to get anywhere close to 45% more performance. And I think you'd actually be lucky to get much above 4.5% more. But let's muddle on through anyway. Now to test, we use the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000 MHz CL30 memory. For all of our testing, we used an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to alleviate any bottlenecks, and the latest version of Windows 11 was used. Though we are showing all 3 resolutions in this head-to-head, our main focus is, as always, going to be on 1080p, because this is where the CPU is at its highest level of utilization, and higher resolutions will see the CPU usage drop as the GPU takes over the workload. We've tested both processors in a total of 42 games, and we'll be showing 15 here today, while also looking at the percentage differences between the two in all 42 titles. Though if you do want to see the individual data for all 42 games, then we will be putting them up onto our Patreon, where you also get a ton of other cool and exclusive benefits, as well as helping to support everything that we do on the channel. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with A Plague Tale Requiem, and it's here where we see that right off the bat the two CPUs are pretty much neck and neck, with the 7700X only sitting a single FPS ahead in the averages of both 1080p and 1440p, whilst 4K sees the two processors sitting completely identically. Something of note is the 1% lows. At 1080p, the 7700X sits a small jump of 5% over the 7600X, and even though it's not much, this does fall outside of margin of error territory. 1440p is another story though, with the 1% lows falling a single frame apart in favour of the 7600X, but a gap this small is just margin of error, and we class it as the same. Then 4K, much like with the average FPS, is identical, so not much to really say here. Next up is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and we again see some pretty small differences in performance, with the 1080p average sitting just 2% apart, whilst the 1% low FPS sits at a more respectable 7% difference. But with frame rates this high, you're probably not going to notice this anyway. 1440 and 4K both show the same behaviours, with the 7700X falling a margin of error 1 FPS behind the 7600X and 3 FPS behind in the 1% lows. Something I should point out now is that instances like this we did retest a number of times to validate these results, but it seems that the 7600X's slightly faster base clock is enough to provide that little bit of extra performance, though again, at such close numbers, it's at least in our eyes identical. Baldur's Gate 3 is our next game, and again we're seeing little to no difference in frame rates, with the biggest jump coming once again from 1080p with a margin of error lead of 3% taken by the 7700X. Then at 1440p the average FPS sits identically and not even that far off the 1080p results, as we only sit 2% worse performing than the 7700X did at 1080p. But interestingly, the 7600X actually gained a few FPS, not by much, and it is margin of error difference, but it's still worth pointing out. Also, I should point out that the 1% lows at 1440 also sit pretty much identically, but with a single FPS between them in favour of the 7600X, while 4K also sees identical performance on averages, and now the 1% low FPS actually ends up a little wider. This is still only a margin of error difference of 3%, but interesting to say the least, especially given the higher price point of the Ryzen 7. Moving on to Call of Duty, where we start to see some significant jumps in performance. The 7700X manages to achieve a pretty sizable 18% more frames per second than the 7600X did in this title, and maintains this lead as we go up in resolution. Naturally though, as the GPU starts to do more of the work, the gap does shrink down to 5%, but this is still above margin of error. Then 4K again sees a drop in performance, with the 7700X now only taking a lead of 3%. So even though the averages are a margin of error apart, the 1% lows from the 7700X do actually sit 12% ahead of the Ryzen 5, meaning that you would have a smoother gameplay experience overall. Counter-Strike 2 is up next, and here we have a weird set of results, but as we addressed in a previous video, this is likely to do with the way that the game is using the GPU resources more at 4K than it is the CPU actually affecting things. But regardless, both CPUs showed similar behaviours, and we used the same hardware for all of the testing, so it's still a fair test. Regardless, at 1080p the 7600X is still falling behind somewhat, with a gap of 8% between the chips, which at such high frame rates is pretty significant, as that works out at just under 40 frames per second. 1440p has the two CPUs falling right down to another margin of error difference, this time of 2%, then 4K follows suit and sees a 3% difference. But in reality, the performance is so high in all of these tests that you're not going to notice anyway. Next, we're moving over to Cyberpunk 2077, where we see pretty much the same thing we've already seen. 1080p had the biggest jump in performance, going from the 7600X to 7700X with a jump of 5%, which isn't that great considering the 45% disparity in price. Then 1440p has identical average frame rates, but with an 8% boost in performance in the 1% lows, which might be enough to make for a smoother gameplay experience. Then at 4K the CPU split up a little, but not by much, with just 4% between them, so right on the border of margin of error. But with both CPUs sitting just above 60 FPS, as the lows sit pretty much on the 50 FPS mark, you're basically looking at the same experience here. When we enable ray tracing, things do fall into place a little more, with the performance difference at 1080p sitting just on the cusp of margin of error at 4%, with the 1% lows actually providing an even better 9% jump. Then things narrow a bit at 1440p, but with lower frame rates, and this means that the difference is still 4%. Then there's 4K, where the two CPUs are completely identical in both average and 1% lows, so really at 4K there isn't much to talk about, and you can just safely assume that the cheaper CPU is the better option. I mean, it's going to save you money overall. Moving on to F123, and here we're seeing some more jumps in performance from the 7700X, with 1080p seeing a reasonable 9% more performance on average, which doesn't sound all too impressive until you consider that it's a 34 frame per second jump. And with these high frame rates, the percentage just seems a bit deflated. At 1440p, the 7700X keeps up the pace with a 6% lead in average frame rates over the 7600X. Then 4K comes in and ruins the party with another identical result in the averages. But in the 1% lows, the 7600X is the better performing of the two by a few FPS. Not enough to make the game feel any different, but still worth mentioning. In Far Cry 6 we aren't seeing much between the two processors, and at 1080p we have a lowly 1% performance difference in favour of the 7700X, with a slightly bigger 5% lead in the 1% lows. Then at 1440p the gap is actually slightly larger, now with still a margin of error 3% between them, still in favour of the Ryzen 7. Then 4K is a far cry from what we've seen so far is what I would say if the performance wasn't borderline identical again, with only a single FPS difference in the averages and 4 FPS in the lows. These chips perform so close to each other that you aren't really going to notice any difference when gaming anyway. Next up is Hogwarts Legacy, and once again we're seeing some pretty small increases in performance when going up from the 7600X to the 7700X. At 1080p we're seeing just 4% more performance, which does fall into margin of error territory and only equates to just 5 FPS, so it doesn't really matter all that much. 1440p has a slightly bigger jump with just under 6% more performance as both CPUs drop in frame rate as the resolution goes up, but neither actually dropped all that much, and we ended up with only a 1 frame loss on the 7700X and only 3 FPS on the 7600X, so 1440p seems like a pretty decent middle ground. Then there's 4K, and at this point I'd be surprised if it wasn't pretty much identical. Yes, we see the CPUs get almost the same frame rate, with the 7600X only falling behind by a single frame, but it falls behind quite a bit more in the 1% lows, where it only manages 53 frames per second, which is 10% behind the 59 FPS from the 7700X. Spider-Man is next, and here we can see the 7700X taking a somewhat decent lead over the 7600X at 1080p, with 5% more performance, so more than margin of error, and more than we've been seeing on the averages so far, but not the best we've seen, and still not great when casting your mind to the price of each CPU. At 1440p the gap becomes a lot smaller, separated by just 2 frames per second, which works out to just 1%, which is pretty much nothing. Then the gap widens again at 4K, with the 7700X now sitting with a margin of error 3% more performance on average. So overall we are seeing better performance, but like we've seen before, it's not by much. When we enable ray tracing there is very little I can actually say. At 1080p the two chips just have identical average frame rates, with a small difference of only 2% in the lows. 1440p is a similar story, but the CPUs do average with a single frame between them and 2 frames in the lows. So we're still seeing pretty much the same result. Then 4K is again much of the same, the CPUs are only a single frame apart in the averages, and the same goes for the lows. But whilst the 7700X has the edge on the 7600X in the averages, that changes in the lows, where the 7600X actually ends up being the better performing of the two. But as I keep finding myself having to say, with such a small difference, you're really not even going to notice when gaming, but you will notice that big dent in your wallet if you buy the Ryzen 7 CPU. Microsoft Flight Sim is always an interesting one for CPUs because it always seems to be a mixed bag, but here it falls very much in line with the majority of the other games we've looked at today. At 1080p there's only a small 2% difference between the two CPUs, with the 7700X taking the unsurprising lead. And with 1440p we see yet another instance of identical performance in the averages, though granted there is a small boost in the 1% lows of 3%, which is still margin of error. Then we have 4K, and interestingly the 7700X didn't really lose any performance, sitting only 2 FPS worse off than its own 1440p frame rate. As a result of this, the gap actually extended a bit to 4%, which means it's still margin of error and is unlikely to be noticeable anyway. Next up is Remnant II, and here we have some weirdness. At 1080p the 7600X actually ends up being the better performing CPU, with just under 6% more performance on average than the 7700X. This took me off guard when I was testing, and I ended up retesting and retesting over and over again, only to find the same results. Then eventually I realised that this is due to the higher base clock of the 7600X, which the game took advantage of and allowed the GPU to spit out those few extra frames. Then 1440p is exactly the same in the averages and the lows, with 4K also seeing the two CPUs fall exactly in line in the averages, but this time with a 5% difference in the 1% lows in favour to the 7700X, which at these lower frame rates only actually accounts for just 3 frames per second, which again isn't going to make a noticeable difference in game. Our last game is Watch Dogs Legion, and straight away we see very little differences in the averages, with just 2% more performance going to the 7700X, with the two CPUs seeing identical 1% lows. 1440p has a slightly wider gap in the averages at 5%, whilst the 1% low figures take a pretty big split, going from identical at 1080p to 8% at 1440p. To finish up at 4K, and one last time we're going to say that the performance is borderline identical, with a margin of error difference between the two CPUs, so again, this isn't going to be noticeable in game. So I don't want to say I told you so, but it was pretty clear that when it comes to gaming, the 7700X clearly doesn't give as much of an uplift as what you'd expect given its higher price point. At 1440p or 4K, the results are so close that it would be hard to tell them apart. And even then at 1080p, really wasn't much in it, with arguably a few games here and there that saw bigger variances, but nothing to the scale that's expected for the extra outlay in cash. Now of course, this is only 15 games and we actually have thrown them through 42 titles in total to see exactly what kind of performance gains are there on a broader pool of games. It's here when we look at the percentage differences that we see the 7700X taking the lead in most titles, but sadly it's not by much, with an overall average of just 3%, which is margin of error. It's safe to say that the Silicon Lottery could be a big decider in how this chart could look, as we could have a really good 7600X and a not so good 7700X, but with that out of the equation, it wouldn't really change the outcome all that much. Regardless, we do see a few games with much better performance than the 7600X, with Call of Duty and Starfield being the top two examples at 19% faster and 11% faster respectively. Whilst the 7600X does take 2 wins, only one of them is outside a margin of error with Remnant II, which we already mentioned particularly liked the higher base clock of the Ryzen 5 CPU, and being an early UE5 game, that kind of makes sense as it does favour less but faster cores. Most of the games here fall within the margin of error category, and retesting could easily change the layout of this chart, but again, not by much. And with such a big difference in price and such similar results, it seems already pretty obvious what the cost per frame will look like. Now before we get into that, we have to have a quick look at the 1% lows, because it was a point of contention throughout some of the games that we tested. Here we see similar results to the averages, with a few small changes, with the 7600X taking a few more victories, with the likes of Control with ray tracing and Red Dead Redemption sitting over the margin of error threshold. There is a lot more here that falls outside of margin of error, with the majority of the wins from the 7700X being more than 4%. There are also a couple of games where performance was identical, like Watch Dogs and Baldur's Gate, but overall the 7700X did come in on average 4% faster in the lows compared to the 7600X. So you could argue that the gameplay experience may feel somewhat smoother, but at them levels, with the performance being so close and the price being so dissimilar, what does that actually really mean for overall value? Well, it's pretty much what you'd expect. At 1080p, the frame rate difference was at its largest, with a margin of error 3% more performance from the 7700X. And since this is the largest gap with the most frames per second, our cost per frame doesn't fall all that far apart, with the 7700X coming in 37 cents more expensive per frame. And this is where it's the most, let's say, reasonable. But it's hard to ignore the 7600X at under $1 per frame. 1440p sees this difference get much worse, with the average frame rates dropping and becoming almost identical, and therefore the cost goes up to $1.46 per frame, up from $1.33 that we had at 1080p. This new price means that the 7700X is now 44 cents more expensive per frame when compared to the Ryzen 5. Then 4K brings shame to the 7700X, as both CPUs have the exact same overall average FPS, and this is, well, bad news for the Ryzen 7, as it means the cheaper CPU can only be the better choice. And with the 7600X coming in at $1.42 per frame, it's pretty embarrassing, especially when you realise that this is less expensive than the 7700X at 1440p. The 7700X also manages to be 63 cents more expensive per frame here, and now comes in at $2.05 per frame, which to me just doesn't seem like a great deal when I can get the same performance for nearly $100 less. So yeah, it's a nice easy one. If you're gaming, avoid the 7700X and just buy a 7600X instead. Thank you and good night. In all seriousness, I didn't expect this to go any other way. The Ryzen 5 X600X chip has always been the highlight for AMD, stemming back through the generations, with the likes of the 1600X, 2600X, 3600X, 5600X, and now this. It's always positioned itself as being top dog when it comes to gaming performance versus cost, and that further cemented itself here today, showing its exceptional value. And that was clear through the resolutions as well. 1080p looked good, 1440p looked good, and 4K just made the 7700X seem inferior. And as we do use an RTX 4090 for our tests, these results at 4K are pretty clear to see in terms of what performance you'd likely get. Of course, no one is going to pair a 7600X and an RTX 4090 and game at 1080p, but to show the merits of each CPU, that's exactly why we did it, to let the processors do the work and show the difference. Again, as I mentioned, the 7700X isn't a one-trick pony, and if you need extra cores for workload-related tasks, then this conclusion would be much different. But today was all about gaming. Now, I'm sure if we threw workload application benchmarks into the mix, I've got no doubt in my mind that the 7600X would still be better in terms of value for money, but the gap would most certainly shrink. Right now, the 7600X is a little over the lowest price it's been in a month, and it does seem pretty consistent with a small drop in April to $199, so in all honesty, waiting around won't see you save much at all, if anything. In contrast, the 7700X has seen some higher price fluctuations to the tune of around $20, so a bigger saving could be had. But at $301, it is the lowest price it's been as of late. And while it will look better compared to higher end, more expensive processors, the 7600X is definitely the pick of the bunch right now. And if you're wanting to move to AM5, well, it's the one to go for. And I don't think you'd have any regrets either. So there we have it. An interesting one to say the least, and I think we've clearly shown that some of the more, let's say, mid-range parts can still rival the bigger boys where it matters. And not everyone is going to need a stupidly high-end CPU to get decent performance when it comes to gaming. For now, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us by joining the super special Patreon members club. You'll get access to all of the charts for each individual game, a secret area on our Discord, bi-weekly game nights, Patreon only live streams, and much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.